In this week's episode of Storytime with Ribbit, we're answering a question from Linnell Green. Linnell writes, in traveling from Lincoln, Nebraska to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, how much time do you spend at each store along the way? Is it better to book hotel rooms beforehand or just wing it and hope to find an open room? Well, Linnell, I have a topic in my book, Tips for the Traveling Quilter, that covers just this topic. So, Tips for the Traveling Quilter is available at RonaTheRibbiter.com and Amazon. Let's get started. How to plan a shop hop. A couple of years ago, I took one of those personality tests that show which of the main 7 traits you fall under. Me, I fall under 2 categories pretty much evenly. The people pleaser and the planner. Shocker. Which mostly means that I love to plan things and I really hope everybody loves what I plan. Looking back, I've basically been a project planner most of my life. Even when I was a kid, I enjoyed planning my school projects much more than actually accomplishing them. In fact, it was almost as if once the plan was in place, my hard work was done. Well, it seemed to me anyway. Over the years, I've planned 4 state-to-state moves, including our 3,000-mile trek from Washington State all the way to North Carolina, and more just for fun road trips. So you might say that when it comes to planning shop hop road trips, I'm your girl. To best illustrate my planning process, I'll continue by using the example of the North Carolina mountains trip along the Blue Ridge Parkway. After doing a little research on the quilt shops located along the Blue Ridge Parkway on the North Carolina side, I found a fairly large mountain town called Boone. There are 2 quilt shops located in Boone and plenty of options for lodging, so it seemed like the perfect place to begin my trip. From there, I decided I would work my way west along the Blue Ridge Parkway toward Asheville, North Carolina. Now, if you haven't been to the Blue Ridge Parkway, I highly suggest you add it to your bucket list. Known as America's favorite drive, the Blue Ridge Parkway stretches 469 miles from Cherokee, North Carolina, all the way to Afton, Virginia. Along the parkway, you'll find some of the oldest mountains in the world, the deepest gorge east of the Grand Canyon, breathtaking views, arts and crafting facilities, barn quilt trails, and at least 24 quilt shops along the entire route. As I said, the Blue Ridge Parkway is a must-do trip. For this particular trip, I only had a few days to work with, and as you can imagine, 469 miles will take more than a few days. So, Boone to Asheville would have to do. If you don't already have a set time limit, to figure out how long your trip will be, the first thing you need to do is know how many quilt shops you plan to visit. For most shop hop road trips, you can realistically plan 2 to 3 quilt shops per day, depending on how far apart they are. Also, you can plan to spend an average of 1 hour at each quilt shop. Now, I fully am aware that I can spend several hours at a single quilt shop, especially when I get to talking with the staff and other customers about a project. Yeah. However, taking several shop hop road trips throughout the years, I did the math. Even with our shop hop group of 4 to 6 people, we still only averaged about 1 hour at each quilt shop. For my Blue Ridge Parkway shop hop road trip, I planned to visit a total of 5 quilt shops. Therefore, I knew I would need at least 2 to 3 days minimum to visit them all. When I plan a multi-day road trip, I like to use an online guide to help me see everything laid out. There are several websites you can use for this, and they each have their pros and cons. For instance, Google Maps is most people's go-to website. However, you'll need to know your route ahead of time as Google Maps does not give those suggestions. It does, however, give you driving time between locations, including toll roads and traffic jams. And Google Maps also gives suggestions for dining and where to stay, which is pretty helpful. If you don't know your route ahead of time, I like to use a website called furcot.com. With Furcot, you can add your destination points, including all the quilt shops on Furcot, And Furcot will plan the best driving route for you. It will tell you where to start and the easiest routes in between. Furcot will also give you suggestions on where to stay and other fun things to do in the areas that you'll be visiting. Don't worry, you'll get all these links on the show notes on ronatheribiter.com. Both Google Maps and Furcot are free to use. If you have an RV, which we did, for longer routes or plan to do a lot of road tripping, you can also use roadtrippers.com. This is one of the best online websites for planning road trips. Roadtrippers.com has everything from live maps with traffic advisories to hotel and food suggestions and more. There's also a section with tips and suggestions from other travelers. However, to get the full benefit of roadtrippers.com, there's a yearly fee. The next thing you want to add to your shop hop road trip plan is food. I usually like to plan at least 1 hour per meal if I've packed my own lunch, or I'll plan 1.5 hours if I plan to eat out. That extra half hour allows extra time for driving to and from your lunch destination. Next, I like to add in plenty of extra time to see the sights. On this particular shop hop road trip to the Blue Ridge Parkway, I added in 3 hours each day of extra time. And oh my gosh, was I glad that I did. A little more on that later. So far, I knew I needed at least 5 hours to visit 5 quilt shops and 3 hours each day for extra sightseeing. Adding in lunches and dinners, I knew I would need 3 full days of visiting and an extra 2 days of travel to and from my house. Therefore, my total shop hop road trip would require 5 days. If I haven't mentioned it before, I love antique stores. Stopping at antique stores is almost as much fun on shop hops as the actual quilt shops. So when I was driving along near the Blue Ridge Parkway and happened to round a corner and see a gigantic sign that said Antique Mall, of course I'm gonna stop. And boy, what an antique store. This place was huge. It was a warehouse that had been turned into 2 stories of shopping. Hanging from all the balconies were gorgeous handmade quilts. Rummaging through the many stacks, I found probably 50 more quilts of all different sizes, fabrics, and techniques. I had entirely too much fun spreading them out and admiring the work that went into each one. Sadly, none of the quilts came home with me. However, as I was making my way along the far wall, I happened to look down. On the bottom shelf, halfway hidden, was a Singer machine. Of course, I jumped down to pull it out of its cubby spot, and sure enough, this was a gorgeous old Singer sewing machine, complete with a case cover. The price tag said $50 and it works. So I snatched it up quicker than you can shake a stick, and off to the checkout I went. Surprisingly, the owner didn't even know she had the machine on the shelf. All the better for me, as I've been eyeing these machines for a long time, but this was the first one I found out in the wild. After getting home and looking up the serial number on the Singer website, I discovered that this machine was born in 1913 and predates the featherweight machines by 20 years. How cool is that? Take it from me, you never know what you're going to find on your next shop hop road trip.